Hello, hello. My name's Jez, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Waku's mission and vision. So this group for the virtual offsite was Frank and I trying to look at, how can we take a mission vision statement and kind of, make it work for us and kind of iterate on that and see if we can get some utility out of it. And so if we start with kind of a problem statement of what we're going to cover here, we're going to talk about, what is a mission vision statement and how does that differ from our marketing materials? On our website, it says a family of robust censorship censorship resistant communication protocols designed to enable securely scalable, privacy focused messaging. How is that different from what we need out of a mission and vision statement? We're going to go into why we need it, the audience, and then see if we can get some of that utility that I was talking about. So I think it's easiest to start off with a little bit of a definition of what we're talking about and where we kind of ended up. And then we can talk about the reasons why we ended up there. We see this kind of vision, mission, and principles being these kind of three core pillars. The vision statement we're talking about is what is this world that we're longing for? What's this kind of end goal that we're kind of all driving for? Where the mission is specifically how does Waku contribute towards that mission? And when we looked at a lot of the different organizations and companies out there and all their vision statements or purpose statements, we noticed that a lot of organizations only have one, either a mission or a vision. And we thought it made sense to have two, namely because Waku exists as part of a larger movement. And so it makes sense to kind of articulate our shared vision in that. And then also our mission being how we specifically want to move that forward. And it allows us to kind of highlight both of those, whereas, maybe a corporate entity only needs one. But we're part of something a little bit larger, so it makes sense to kind of enshrine that. And then on the principle side, this is something that comes from me personally and something that I like. It's borrowed from Ray Dalio, this idea that we should have things that we believe in, that when things get hard, we can kind of push back on, go to what our principles are and help guide forward. And so those principles are supposed to be this kind of guiding, governing policy that reflect the team's beliefs about how we should be doing work. And so we go into that kind of purpose, right? The visions for rallying people behind it. That's a very public statement. That's whether you know anything about computers or peer-to-peer networks, it shouldn't matter. You should be able to get behind that vision and kind of believe in what we're trying to achieve. That mission kind of goes a step down. It identifies maybe people who are more aligned with Waku about what we're doing to drive towards that. And once again, those principles are an open contract to our way of working. How does that drive micro decisions? How do we use those on a little bit more daily basis to kind of get utility as we drive forward, and align on contributors' values about what does contributors in the community believe about the importance of our work and what we might not want to sacrifice in pursuit of our mission. And so we get into that audience. I think I kind of already touched on this, but the vision is that larger case, like-minded individuals, much larger. The mission's about contributors and users and advocates. How can they kind of articulate to the public about what Waku wants to do, what their intentions are, and how they fit into this larger puzzle piece. And then the principles are largely focused on contributors. So that's going to be very kind of code-driven. The artifacts are governed by the principles. And so that's going to be people who are producing things and pushing the movement forward. And so we come to this first big problem that I think we all have when we start talking about mission and vision statements is why, right? I think this is my 12th time being involved in a mission vision workshop at an organization. And in all the other cases, they've ended up deep on a website somewhere that no one ever looks at and is lacking a little bit of utility. And so there's this question about how do we take this arguably very useful tool and actually make it work, where in the previous cases, I'd argue that it hasn't. And so we kind of dive in here. We're like, the mission and the vision is largely about driving marketing and our positioning and how people believe. So that's a lot of the JD Docs Discord, providing a little bit of guidance and focus on that. The principles are about how we work. Those are going to be kind of integrated into deliverables and issues. And once again, that kind of guiding tough decisions. And so in this framework, it's important to make sure that it's concise and clear so it can easily be used across those, but also that they have their different utilities and areas. And so when we're looking for guidance, we can kind of come back and use that. And so, as we kind of fit that in, we realize that there's this larger kind of stack that the mission and vision and principles can fall into. And that's our priorities, milestones, and deliverables stack. And so by integrating into process planning, we're hoping that it can have a little bit more utility and kind of be this continuum where at the top, the vision can be this very lofty statement. And then at the bottom, deliverables are very actionable on a week by week basis, right? And so everything else in the middle is about helping drive that forward and provide a little bit more clarity and a little bit more, tactical decision making in order to kind of achieve our vision and our mission. Consequences of this is that the scope's much larger at the top than at the bottom. There's also this kind of implied, how frequently they change. At the bottom, deliverables change quite frequently. And at the vision, things are pretty rock solid. We might change the wording, but the intention is likely going to be stable. And so every step below that has the ability to absorb a little bit more change, particularly the principles. From my personal experience, principles are something that should be updated when we learn, when we find a new way of doing things. And so they should be just a reflection of our current belief state versus, the mission, besides some rewording, is probably going to be a little bit more stabilized. And then the same for, priorities and milestones. They all fit in this continuum of action, scope, and kind of concreteness as we kind of drive forward on our goals. So if we kind of dive in here into the vision, we start to talk about what should it have? What do we first start feeling about this vision, given that we want it to be this large statement? The first thing that Frank and I noticed was that privacy and censorship resistance and, all those are fancy buzzwords that we like to use about the technology, they're actually in service of something. They're not the actual end goal. Our vision's not that there are distributed hash tables for every project, but that those are in service of something more important. And so we want to kind of separate the technology from the goals and let that be, an implementation detail of sorts. It should be the kind of the world we aspire to. It should be something that gets people kind of excited, something that we realize doesn't exist today, but allows us to drive forward. And then we also want to acknowledge that we're a part of a larger, the Logos technology stack, this larger movement. And so the vision should share that with the other projects in the space as well. While also maybe having a little bit of specialization to us. There's some open questions there about how tied it should be. But I think that there is this acknowledgement that we are part of something larger than just Waku. And that allows us to focus on that. For inspiration, we went and we looked at the Logos manifesto. The text here will be very small. It's not intended to be read in its entirety here. You can go to the website and look at it. But when we look at it, we see some reoccurring trends, right? We see this long descriptive case about what the world should look like. In our world, we have a transparent and self-governing monetary policy that serves the interest of our citizens. These are very bold statements. These are very rich in kind of painting the picture of what Logos believes in and is driving for. It's a little bit long in terms of what we're looking for in our case, but it does paint that picture. And so as we look to kind of distill it down, we saw some trends and some things that stood out to us. This idea of collective liberation. We offer those to join us in a liberated territory of cyberspace. It's become a little bit very opinionated in drawing it out, but it talks about freedom of people. It talks about the use of cryptography and technologies in order to deliver us privacy, which in turn would then give us the freedom to communicate, freedom of expression, anonymous and not elitist. As we kind of pick out these kind of buzzwords from the vision, it's worth kind of taking that and seeing where we could distill it down as kind of a first take. We see no one is free until we're all free, this kind of idea of unity and treating everyone equally. And so as we kind of extracted that down, we came up with this initial wording of a world where freedom of expression and privacy are guaranteed by an underlying technology for anybody, anywhere. We also ran it through an LLM just to see if they could come up with anything better. A digital future where freedom, agency, or human agency flourishes beyond the reach of surveillance and coercion. That has a little bit more of that focus on the particulars and the technology, surveillance being a tool of oppression rather than anything else. But I think it's worthwhile leaving it in there for, a little bit of a context. But so the vision we currently have working here is, that world where we're trying to talk about expression and privacy being important, and then it being empowered for everybody everywhere. Well, in the discussion phase, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, and we can kind of dive in. These aren't set in stone. These are, we tried to move it forward as much as possible to get a sense of, kicking off a conversation. But there's some work here to make sure it reflects everybody. As we moved on to mission, the previous take on this came up with the, where we started here, this simplified of create open, reliable, scalable, and self-sustaining communication protocols, software and networks for building private, censorship-resistant applications that run on everyday devices. It's fairly long. We thought about adding in a little bit more of that human meaning, about human agency, really driving forward what we're trying to achieve rather than just relying on that technical stack. And after we kind of workshopped it a little bit, I think our current working best is to make usable censorship-resistant communication a reality. Once again, we've removed the superfluous technology parts in there and really focused on the parts that we care about, that censorship resistance. We could probably do a better job of explaining about why we want that censorship resistance. Starts getting into a little bit more opinionated, so there's a little bit of a balance there. But in terms of our mission, Waku, we felt like this represented. We'd love to hear everyone's feedback on that. As we kind of shift over to this principles focus, the goal was to have an actionable set of things that we can go back on and beliefs. I think this is an area where there's lots of discussion we can have about making sure that these fit the team. We tried our best to kind of get a representative of them, but I think this is an area where you can definitely, workshop this a little bit more. We came up with the release early, release often, and dog food, largely borrowing from the cathedral and the bazaar. As I reflect on this one, I think it's very important that Waku does have this fairly strong dog food culture that I think is worth holding on to and at least writing it down. The importance of principles is that they are written and that we can learn and grow from them as we learn more. And so the important part is that we see that change when it's written down. So having that in place is very helpful, I think. Start with narrow scopes and increment on them. The idea that we're not trying to boil the ocean, but make small movements towards this lofty goal that we have. Deliver protocol specification and implementations together. I think this is probably the core one that I see from Waku, being a relatively new addition here, is that Waku's core belief in that the specifications and the code are equal halves of a solution here. One is the idea that can be shared amongst and is implementation independent, yet also providing the ability for people to jumpstart today or see how that could actually look in practice, while also giving it a little bit of a battle-tested approach. Wordings we can talk about and kind of move on, but I think that that's definitely a core principle that I think Waku has. Discuss design and code in the public, very similar. We see that in order to make progress towards what we want, we have to work together. It's not something we can do on our own. It's not some cabal of 4 people in a Discord who can achieve this, but this is core contributors, community at large, everybody who shares our mission and value. We need to be involving in this process. From initial talks to implementations and testing all the way through the pipeline. Single purpose components to have reusable code. This idea of modularity can be very important as we look at the decentralized web. Having pieces that developers can choose to use or not, making sure that we're reusable across the spectrum so we're not wasting efforts. Just good kind of coding practices. We see that having an important part is distilling into our principles. Languages of choice are TypeScript in the browser and NIM for the rest. That's a belief that Waku holds. Working examples over documentation. This one's pretty spicy. I think that there's some wording we can work on. I think the initial intention was that the working examples are a form of documentation that we believe has lots of value. It's not that one's better than the other as much as they kind of go hand in hand. Having an entire book written on things has some utility, but there's also a lot of utility in having code that people can play with today, who can learn through iteration and changing values. And that's an important part of moving the community forward, is providing them ways to see Waku in action. Take that wording with a grain of salt, perhaps, as we kind of workshop these forward, and build sustainably to maintain a path to desirable properties. That's a call out to the fact that protocols and these large decentralized software pieces can become calcified pretty easily, and we need to kind of keep an open mind as we move forward and build in a very sustainable capacity so that we have all the values that we need. So as we kind of, we touched on what we believe is a good starting point for our mission statements and our values and our principles and our vision. We're kind of looking at the 3 recommendations that we think we should take away from here. One is that both a mission and a vision make sense. Really shows that we're part of something larger, helps us communicate our particular value, but also, a nod to the fact that we're just not out here on our own. On the second point, we have identify the unique way that Waku approaches their work by codifying methodologies or principles, help drive alignment in contributors, help guide when decisions are tough. When we maybe can't agree or the path is unclear, being able to go back to the things that we believe in to provide, a little bit of a light, a North Star would be very helpful. And then number 3 is to make sure that this is all enshrined and written down and being iterated on. And we can talk about places to kind of put that. And so as we kind of move into the discussion phase here, there is ongoing discussions on the Logos forum where there's a feedback request. Anyone's welcome to kind of dig into that. And then, the questions that I'd like to kind of kick this off, if no one has any to begin with, is, does this mission and vision resonate with you? What parts do, what parts don't? And particularly, are there any principles you feel are missing? And also maybe an open chat about what your personal principles are. So I'd invite some people to jump in if they have anything to kind of add. That'd be great. And then for discussion, I can leave up our current working examples so we can dive in and get very pedantic on the words that are being chosen. So I'll wait a moment here to see if anyone pops in. Hello, hello.
Hello. I don't have a specific question at the moment. What I was thinking about throughout the presentation was the sort of dual signal that we want to be putting out in terms of developers and then users that potentially likely will never contribute, but we want them to be looking for the Powered by Waku badge. We want the users that will be using apps that integrate Waku, and how to signal correctly to both groups, so that some of the more technical things that maybe that the users group isn't interested in doesn't get in the way of, or so that user message stands out while the developer message is still effective. Something I was thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's a very well worded point, right? And if we go back to that kind of stack of visions at the tops and deliverables are at the bottom, hopefully in that framework we do have a little bit of space where the top can be a little bit more lofty and a little less technical, describing that world we want to go to. One of the things that stood out to me, they said that there's contributors and there's users, people who won't contribute technically. I might push back on that a little bit and say contribution can come in many different forms. There's technical contributors. There's also those who are out there, kind of pushing the good word, going knocking on doors saying, hey, have you heard about, Waku, this great project? So there are different ways to contribute. And I think that, making sure that the mission and vision includes all of those people is a very valid point. I'll take a note on that for sure. Does anyone have any inputs on that topic?
I really like the that layered stack. Do you mind going to that slide actually? With I think it is vision at the top. Yeah, all the way down to deliverables. I've been thinking a lot about like dependency graphs lately, and I feel like what you have here could be made into a dependency graph for our entire organization, and it allows us, if you go past you can keep going past deliverables all the way to like GitHub PRs and commits and like individual code changes, and you should be able to have a way to show how changing this one line of code can be traced all the way up to our vision. Ideally, practically, maybe not to the level of every line of code, but yeah, I think that this is great, and it helps kind of like have a picture of the whole organization, a detailed picture, right? Not a symbol to sort of abstract it away, which has its own use, but like a real, like useful core chart, I guess.
I mean, one, that's the goal, right? Like I'm sure this is not the first time people have argued over the pedantic nature of wordings and visions and mission statements. The question was, how do we make it kind of usable? The lofty goal of having every line be accountable to the vision, well, it seems like it's a lot of overhead. I'd argue that that's kind of the case, right? A PR needs to be against a deliverable, or a task, or PR against a task against a deliverable. And inside a PR, we review to make sure that it's actually, we're not putting in dead code in there, that has some utility. So there's this kind of loose binding all the way up if you wanted to kind of drive up. Obviously, each line is going to make a very small dent towards that vision, but it moves along a milestone, and a milestone moves along, priority, right? So I think that there is more in there than we might be giving credit for.
Yeah, and also like thinking about like a single line of code can import a package from a project that maybe doesn't align with our vision, and then we have to kind of be aware of that as well. Like we have to, this dependency graph has to literally go to all the way down to our like package dependencies, and ensure that it aligns with us both on like a technical vision and more this like social vision as well.
Yeah, I also see that that's where the principles kind of come in, right? The principles are reasons we might say no to things sometimes. We believe that things need to be radically open. And there's this very for-profit company whose library we like to use. The principle should kind of give us a little bit of a hint about how to approach that incongruency and come to a decision. So there is room to kind of have that brought in this framework.
Yeah, and I think that's why, and you had mentioned this as well, why it's really important for these to be iterative, because at the end of the day, like the vision is only as good as we're able to map it to reality. And it may be that, we find out that in any place in the stack, there might be, blockers, there might be things that we thought were relevant, but are no longer relevant or no longer true. There might be things that, just aren't like a priority for us anymore as we grow as a team and a project. And so, yeah, but knowing where to go to determine like where to change based on scope is powerful.
Yeah. I'll add that Frank and I were playing around with the idea of this living in a repository somewhere, so that PRs would be changes against our beliefs, and there'd be this kind of very durable log that shows where we're at, this idea that it's not static, that it changes, that it's kind of living. Obviously, the vision should be changing a little bit slower rather than clarification updates. But yeah, to kind of give that sense that this is a work product. It's not just, our libraries that we're working on. It's also about how we work.
Sounds like a spec to me.
Specs for everything. That's one of our core principles.
This sounds like it's the highest level spec for the entire organization or project, whichever.
I mean, I'd argue that there's probably already a spec loosely for this called a contributor guide, right? About what do we believe, what is expected from the project, how do others join? How do people come from being a user to a contributor? Part of that's got to be, this is what we believe in. This is what is important. This is, not so much as a statement, but as a declaration of the current community mindshare. Like if the principles, I guess I'm trying to say the principles should be reflective of the beliefs of the community, or the contributor community at least.
If I may jump in.
Yeah, please.
How do we prevent vision drift? I keep remembering Google's "Don't be evil" motto, which they just at some point removed. I was like, okay, well, we have I think a strong vision in fundamental principles. How to make sure that we don't end up becoming something else entirely at some point. I mean, it seems difficult to prevent, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so don't be evil is a principle of Google's, right? I was actually just trying to dig up. I have a big list of the top 500 mission statements. Their vision, mission, purpose statement, I think, is a little bit more. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but it's a little bit more stable, right? Our principles do change as we grow. And so I think that the vision and the mission kind of need to be written in this very inclusive way for the different paths we can go. That's towards, ensuring that people have the right to communicate freely. If we go back to, the mission is to create censorship-resistant communication a reality. And the question is, what's involved in that? Well, you could argue that going to conferences and speaking about the technology we're making is an important part to making that a reality, right? It's a pretty inclusive statement. And once we get the language dialed into what we like, I'd argue that there's probably isn't too much drift there, right? Like the focus is still going to be on these core elements. And if we see drift, then we should make it a little bit more general. Our focuses start coming down into those priorities about what we think is important for driving deliverables and milestones. Having a very clear, encompassing umbrella statement, I think, is the important part, rather than being specific. It's not to bring this version of a hash table to existence, because when we achieve that, then our mission's done, I guess. But it's to kind of acknowledge about why we're out here talking about privacy. What is the main driver for censorship resistance, and kind of moving through. So that would be my argument, that if we make it the most robust as possible by getting as closest to our actual reason. And if we find that it's brittle, then we probably haven't captured the core reason why we're all working on this project. How's that sound?
Yes, this is good. One thing I would add is that fundamentally, if you have a company that is a for-profit entity, their fundamental principle is always make money, because otherwise you die. And I guess survival is, So when you have kind of an ideology on top, that makes things a little bit messier. How to deal with that? It's complicated.
I think that's a great point. And I wish I would have thought of it first so I could put it into my pitch. I'm going to put forward a crazy idea that perhaps that's why most businesses only have either a vision or a mission, because the other one is implicitly to make bucket loads of cash. And probably an argument why we need to have both. The vision is that larger what we want, and then our mission can kind of come in and be what we're actually doing about it. Because I agree with you. Like, we need to capture the why part. I don't imagine that people contribute to Waku to become millionaires. That's it's probably a poor use of your time if that's why we're showing up to work on this.
Yeah, it's more like millionaires contribute to Waku to become poor.
Fair.
But
Yeah, I think having that vision should represent like the why. Why do people find that this is important to work on? Why do contributors want to add to it? Why do users want to see that badge? This is powered by Waku and be like, yeah, right? Like that larger overarching item.
yes,
and I think
I
you get
agree
there from
a lot.
being aggressively honest.
Yeah, because in I think in our space, if you don't actually stand by your principles, then like what you stand for, like there's nothing differentiating you from any other whatever tech studio that's building cool stuff, right?
Couldn't have said it better. If anyone hasn't read it, Ray Dalio has a book called Principles, based upon a essay that he wrote from 2011, which I found to be very inspirational. But it's about write down the things that you believe in and uphold them. You know, kind of a strong ideas weakly held kind of principle, and that they should be governing everything. And if they're not, then find the ones that you do care about, and driving everything forward from there. So that's kind of the intention behind it. Yeah, having principles that we can look back on and be like, this is what we believe is an important aspect. If they're not there yet, then we need to get them there, right? That's the important part about principles, is that they do change somewhat frequently as we learn more. So consider this a call to action wherever this ends up living, or in this call to kind of fight for the things that you believe are important. Anyone else have a question? Comments? Concerns?
Looks like that's all the questions.
Perfect. Well, thanks for listening to the rant. You'll be able to find more information. We'll post it in the Discord about where this is going to live, and look forward to everyone's input.